good stories, something goes wrong. Something has to go wrong, and something has to go wrong pretty early on, or people are going to lose interest because we don't like to just see a depiction of perfect life. That's very boring. So people who paint themselves as too perfect, they've already lost their audience.
Get ready to build, protect, and sell your expertise online with the Online Genius Podcast. You'll laugh. We hope you won't cry, but you'll always be informed and prepared so you can have the success you want. Here's your host, Bobby Klink.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Online Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Klink, and I'm really excited for today's show because we're going to be talking about a skill that I think we all too often overlook. That's the power of storytelling and using stories as the basis for how we communicate with our tribes and with potential customers. And luckily, you're not going to have to listen to me because who really wants to listen to a lawyer talk for a long time? Instead, I brought on a fantastic guest expert today by the name of Christie Bilbrey. Christie is a marketing and story strategist. After focusing really exclusively on marketing strategy earlier in her career, she realized that entrepreneurs needed something more than just marketing and marketing strategy to stand apart from the crowd. So she spent some time analyzing what her favorite influencers were doing to see how they promoted themselves and how they got her excited and how they did it without feeling like they were giving a sales pitch or being overly salesy. And she wondered if they had some kind of superpower, if there was something innate. And what she discovered was that they all were excellent storytellers. So recognizing that storytelling was the key, she spent a year studying story techniques from screenwriters, authors, and business writers. And she now teaches and works with business owners to view their stories differently, developing their confidence while sharing their heart, expertise, and journey in well-packaged stories sprinkled throughout their marketing. In essence, Christie teaches business owners how to turn their personal stories into potent, effective sales tools. Now that sounds pretty cool, and I want to hear all about it. So welcome to the Online Genius Podcast, Christie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Now, Christie, I'm excited to talk about this. I think I mentioned to you when we first talked about you coming on the show that I'm actually going to go through a storytelling course or a program here in Washington, D.C. So this is something that I think is a fantastic topic. But I always like to ask my guests a little bit about themselves before we jump into the topic. And in preparing for the show today, you told me that you actually got to meet Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. Now, as someone who went to space camp as a kid, I got to tell you that sounds pretty cool. So why don't you tell us that story?
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know the little twist about you going to space camp. That's pretty cool. I actually fell into it. My very first mentor is one of the most amazing people who I have ever met. And she happened to be friends with Sally Ride, and they worked together to promote girls getting interested in more math, science, the STEM areas of study. And so she was in Phoenix, which is where I am and where I grew up. And she was there to promote a big event. And Barbara, my mentor, said, hey, Sally's going to need a ride from her hotel over to the news station to do an interview. Would you mind doing that? So I, at the time, was 21 years old and was just completely starstruck, right? This is someone who, when I was young, heard about, and now it's just this casual, hey, can you drive her over where she needs to be? So she was very nice, very relaxed, and we were chatting, and I'm thinking, what do I talk to this woman about in the car? And at the time, so I'm dating myself, but at the time, this was like, early 2000s. And there were a lot of people who were wanting to pay to go into space, people who were celebrities or just super rich. So I thought, okay, well, this is kind of a topic du jour. So I asked her what her thoughts were I think it was one of the Backstreet Boys or one of the NSYNC guys wanted to go into space. And I asked her what she thought about that and what she thought the future of space held for who gets to go up and why. And she was actually very much for it. She said, I think that it should be something that more people are able to experience. And she said, I'd love to see some sort of almost lottery system where just everyday people might be able to get an opportunity, to have that experience. So it was just interesting. And we ended up having a cool conversation on where she saw the history of space travel about almost 20 years ago.
I have to say, I'm impressed that you can remember that story because I really can't remember much, that I could tell that good of a story about something that happened to me when I was 21. So that's pretty impressive.
Well, it definitely made an imprint on me.
Yeah. Well, but I think that's a good way to transition because I think you're good at telling stories because you've spent time really building up that skill. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs aren't doing this. We probably all heard people talk about how you need to tell stories, but I think a lot of us don't do it. And before I get to the nitty gritty though, about how to do it and what and all those things, let's start with the why. Why is a story such a powerful tool for an entrepreneur or other business owner?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of people don't share story because, like me, a few years back, I didn't feel comfortable with it. And especially if it was stories about myself. So a lot of us say, okay, you know what? I'm just going to be the best person to give the latest trends, tips, statistics, news about my area so that I'm giving my clients and my audience what they need. But the problem with that is that's the exact same thing that all of our competitors are doing, right? So if you're in the audience and you're looking at this from your audience's perspective, then you are hearing a lot of different voices. And if you're trying to remember who was who, you're not really giving them something that's specifically differentiating you from what your competitors do. So the only thing, in my opinion, the only thing that really sets you apart is who you are. And that is based on the stories of your life, your experiences, what has shaped you. Why do you think your approach is important? So to me, the only way that you can truly stand out and get ahead and influence and have a memorable connection is by connecting with someone in who you are in a way that relates to who they are. Those are the people we remember. Those are the people we connect with. And those are the people that we trust. And so there's a lot of talk in marketing about what do you need? You need the know, like, and trust factor. So the fastest way that you can increase that know, like, and trust factor with your audience is to help them get to know your character, your journey, your credibility in an interesting way, because those are all the pieces they need to know. And we just want to quicken the amount of time that it takes for them to know that so that they can say, okay, I like her. I relate to her. I can appreciate she's done these things and I want to pay attention, or I'm ready to click the button.
I think that's great advice. And I had a feeling that's where you were going to go. But I also like that the way you started that answer, where you talked about part of your problem initially was you didn't feel comfortable. And I think that's a big problem for a lot of people. They're shy or they're nervous. What advice do you have for people to help them overcome that fear or that kind of uncomfortable feeling in injecting their own stories into their brand story?
For me, I think the most important thing that people need to realize that I think will help them quite a bit is that it's their relatability that is going to help them really connect with people. So it's sharing some of those imperfections of their journey or their flaws that actually help them stand out. If they seem too perfect, then they're not going to be relatable. So I would say just know that whatever your story is, a lot of people, I feel like, fall into two camps. They either think, nobody cares about my story, it's really boring, it's really blah, or they feel like, I've had some really interesting things happen, but it's just a jumbled mess of a million things that I don't know how it could possibly be fit into a cohesive story or set of stories. So I think when you first think about, okay, what do you have that can relate to other people and not try to have this really impressive wow factor. That can take a lot of the pressure off. And when you realize that if you do mess up on something, or you share some of your imperfections, or you just tell your audience, yeah, this is actually really difficult for me to do, that is endearing. And your audience will appreciate that because chances are they feel the exact same way. And that's only going to draw them closer to you.
Well, let me dive a little deeper on that. I tend to think that there are kind of two kinds of entrepreneurs who are in the space that you're in, or something like I am in online marketing and entrepreneurship and those types of things. There's the people who are trying to kind of help entrepreneurs or people who are, let's say, 2, 3, 5, some point earlier in their journey. Right. So they've already walked the journey that their customers have. And then there are the people like me who are kind of different, right? I'm an expert because of my education. And I think for people like me, there is an especially strong feeling like if I share my imperfections, I lose a sense of my authority. How would you kind of advise someone like me who might have that concern to deal with that and to overcome that fear?
Okay, well, let me ask you this. When you read, we're talking about our own stories, so I'm going to liken this to a biography. If you're reading a biography, then a lot of times what stands out and what really draws people in to who that person is, especially if it's someone who has been very successful, who's been seen in a very, bright lights and maybe some glamour or something aspirational, then the thing that really draws people is sharing pivotal moments. So I think there are a couple different ways you can look at this. You can just say, hey, here's where I'm at. I'm just being real. Or you can look at it and say, I've had a lot of experience. I have done a lot of great things, but how do I just share this in an interesting way? Then that's where I would encourage, and the way that I work with my one-on-one clients, and actually what I teach in my course, is starting when you're going into your own story, start with a brainstorm and go back to those pivotal moments in life. Think about the things that you just enjoyed or struggled with or overcame, because it doesn't matter who you're looking at, if it's the biography of a president or an esteemed athlete, whoever it is, you want to connect with them in some way. So we always love stories of overcoming. So if you can say, yeah, I've done these things, but here's how I was able to overcome it. Or I actually used to work at a law firm and I did marketing strategy there. So, when we were working on pitching for new business, we would highlight specific partners and we would talk about, these are landmark cases that they have won, but, we would talk about some of what was involved. Here's what we were up against. Here's what made this so difficult. Here's what made it hard to overcome. This wasn't easy. This didn't come easily. And I think what really makes someone connect with someone is to know that when they have achieved something, it didn't come easily. So going back to those pivotal moments in how you were able to overcome, it is going to share your credibility, but it's also going to share your character. And that is the part that's going to help people emotionally connect. And when we think about establishing memories in our brain, which I also get into in my course, I won't go in depth here, but it's those deep emotions that we can relate to that help us have a deeper memory of someone. So when you want staying power, you do need an emotional connection. And frankly, a lot of people end up making buying decisions based off of emotional connections. So while you might not want to show all your cards, and I definitely don't believe in being vulnerable for vulnerability's sake, I think it should always kind of relate back to what you're doing, what your purpose is. But sharing those pivotal moments and how you've overcome can go a really long way quickly with your audience.
I think that's great advice, but let me dig a little deeper on one of those points, because I could hear potentially some listeners having some worry about using their personal story and the reasoning being slightly different. And that's, I don't know if you've heard this analogy, but some people make this story or an analogy to Star Wars, where the brand, in creating a brand story, you should be Obi-Wan Kenobi, not Luke Skywalker. You're not the hero. Your customer is the hero. And so I think some people might be concerned that, hey, if I start telling too many of my own stories, I am trying to make myself the hero. How do you address that kind of concern that people might have?
Yes. Okay. So totally agree. I kind of see them as two separate pieces. So let me explain. And I always give the Star Wars example. So I'm glad you already went there. So I think when it comes to who you are in relation to your client, you are the mentor. You are the one equipping them for their journey. And so that is part of saying, hey, I have all of this experience, I have the credibility, I know the tools, and I'm going to train you for the battle, your own journey that lies ahead. So when it comes to just the way that you think about your relationship to your audience, yes, you're not the hero, you are the mentor. However, they have to decide which mentor is right for them. And so when they are looking at potential mentors, then they have to see who understands me, who is going to best equip me. And they're going to know that by being able to relate to that person. So there are stories that are going to connect with them, and there are stories that are going to show, well, and really, it doesn't even have to be in stories per se. It can just be in your messaging. So I use stories to lead with stories, to hook the audience. And then once you establish that connection with them, then they're ready to listen to your message points of, okay, this person really is going to be the right person. I like the way they shape their messaging. That resonates with me. I want to follow that. But remember, they have a lot of options out there. So while you do want to be the mentor to them, you're going to bring them in by showing them in your own life, when you have had to be the hero, what did that look like? What type of heroes are you helping to create through your method?
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And the way you break it down into the stories or what make them choose you as a mentor is a fantastic way to look at it. Now, I think I have some of the sense of this from some of your previous answers, but let me ask you just straight up. Are there certain elements to a good story for an entrepreneur?
Oh, yes.
And what are they? I mean, what are the kind of the important elements that you need to have for a story to be a good story?
Well, so a few that people can just start implementing right away. I would say you really want to hook them right off the bat. So good stories, something goes wrong. Something has to go wrong, and something has to go wrong pretty early on, or people are going to lose interest. If you look at any TV show or movie that you like, there's probably an opening scene where they're painting a picture of the way normal life looks for this person in this situation. And then very quickly, something goes wrong, because we don't like to just see a depiction of perfect life. That's very boring. So people who paint themselves as too perfect, or people who wait too long to go into what went wrong, they've already lost their audience. So you need to engage your audience as quickly as possible. And the way that you're going to hook them is with something going wrong. And this has to be something went wrong that basically taps into a core struggle that your audience struggles with. So you have been told, I'm sure, to look for your audience's pain points. So then when it comes to story, you're going to think about, what stories do I have from my own life that can relate to this pain point, even if the circumstances are drastically different. I always tell people the circumstances of your story isn't what's going to make people relate. It's the struggle. So it's funny. I always give this example of astronaut, but I've never shared that Sally Ride story. So this fits pretty perfectly now. Let's say that you are a corporate mom and you want to relate to astronauts. It's a very small niche field, but let's say that's what you're going for. Now, how are you going to relate to them when your life's experience has been drastically different? You would have to go to themes of common struggles. So those could be isolation. Those could be spending a long time away from your family, extended periods of time, kind of guilt associated with that. So those are the themes that are going to connect with the astronauts. Now, here's a movie example. We'll take it out of, the business realm for a minute. There was a movie a long time ago called Rudy about this guy who wanted to play on his college football team and had a series of obstacles and couldn't. And that movie, for probably a decade or more, people had a very strong emotional connection to it. People in movie theaters everywhere were crying at the end because, he was able to get on the team and he scored the winning touchdown in the championship game. It was this perfect storybook moment. So why did people care? Because they aren't going to want to get onto their college football teams. They're doing whatever it is in life. The reason that they connected was because they related to the core struggle of having these obstacles tell them that they couldn't pursue something in life, but they did it anyway. So it's that persistence. So I think going back to your earlier question, even, what is it that you can share to relate to your audience if you've gone to Harvard Law School and had a very successful career as a lawyer, and that's not at all where your audience is, or frankly, what they're interested in pursuing. And so again, it's going back to those pivotal moments where you share a struggle of some difficulty that you've had to overcome.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. And so what I heard, a couple of things there that you said are elements. One, hook them right up front with something going wrong, and then also find some kind of struggle that even if it's in a different situation, they can relate to it. And those are kind of, in some sense, two of the big pillars that every great story needs to have.
Yeah. And then, really quickly, a couple of others, you want to paint a picture because your whole goal, everybody's bombarded by a gazillion ads all the time. And so you need staying power in their brain. And so the way that you do that is the language that you use needs to be descriptive. So think about using sensory language, using emotional language, anything that can help quickly create a mental picture. Because if they start playing a mental movie in their head, that's automatically going to shut out other thoughts and other distractions, and it's going to help them focus on you and whatever it is you're talking about.
Okay, so I think we've got some good elements there, but now I want to turn a little bit to the nuts and bolts here. So now we have a sense of what you need at the end of the day to have a good story. How do you go about starting to craft a story, to figure out what the story or stories are that you're going to use in your business? Where's the starting point for an entrepreneur?
Really, I think it's getting into the head of your customer, really trying to understand what it is they need, where they struggle, why they aren't already achieving it, and both how you can relate to their struggle as well as how whatever it is that your product or service delivers. So you can look at that in terms of success stories or customer stories, what they have gone through in a way that your customer can relate to that. Or, people always want to hear backstories and they love behind the scenes stories. So once, let's say there's different periods of your customer's journey. First, you're kind of wooing them into even noticing you, and then it's getting to work with them. And then once they've worked with you in some capacity or purchased something that you have to offer, you still need to continue nurturing that relationship. It doesn't just end once you've made a sale, because we all like to make repeat, we want to have people make repeat purchases. So once you've delivered certain types of stories that is just going to draw them into who you are, you need to keep helping them get to know you on a continual basis. And that's where things like you see really popular type of story is a behind the scenes story. So once somebody knows you, how do they keep getting to know what's going on in your life? I really like people to think about it just like they would any relationship. Online dating is huge right now. So there's, some things that you're going to share to get that first date. But just because you got the first date doesn't mean that's where they stop getting to know you. You have to keep that going. So stories are a great way first to introduce yourself, but also you need to think about what types of things, once someone knows me, what else would they be interested in knowing about me so that I can retain loyalty and they don't go to my competitor. So that's where you have to start thinking about, I recommend things like story journals. So it's just what's going on in your week. What are you studying? We talked about things that you're interested in and that you're studying right now. So even if somebody already knows you, they want to know, well, what's the latest? What's going on? So it's making sure to remember that those are important to share with your audience as well on an ongoing basis. But when it comes to first getting started with someone, you need to think about what you would need to first get started with something that you are seeking. What is it that speaks to you? And that's going to be a little bit different for everyone. And everyone's brand is going to be a little bit more reflective of their own personality. So for me, I value a lot of vulnerability. That's really important to me. I want someone to be transparent. And frankly, buyers today, they want brands to be transparent. They want to know what goes on behind the scenes. They want them to have an amazing product or service. They want them to care about humanity. They have a lot of wants. And so the best way to make it fun and interesting to package your response is through sharing stories. And they don't have to be in depth. They can be small snippets.
Well, so let me start here because I think there's a couple pieces there. One, I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I think you'll have a certain number of stories that become kind of your core brand stories that you tell a lot.
Yes.
And separately, you'll have the kind of things that are the day-to-day things that maybe you use in an email, about a certain struggle or in a blog post. But those I think of as more kind of just what's happening. Is that a good way to break up the different kinds of stories?
Yeah, I would say typically your brand stories are a few key pivotal moments and how you journeyed through those moments. And those are really what compose your brand story that, like you said, you're going to put everywhere. And then you have other stories that either something that does come up that has a big impact or just what is going on in the life of you and your brand that you think is important. And dependent on the personality of your brand, what is it that you and your audience care about? So if those things are coming up in the news or, there's been some major change, instead of just sharing, here's the trend, here's the news story, share how that has affected your business or how that has affected your customers. Make it something that you can kind of unite together in. And that also helps keep establishing that sense of loyalty and community related to you specifically, your brand.
Okay, well, let me focus on the first guy, the brand stories. Ideally, or not ideally, but on average, how many stories would a typical entrepreneur have that are kind of their big brand stories that they're going to tell quite often? Is it 2? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 20? What's the number there?
Well, I would start with 1. So when people are getting started, I would start with your core brand story about why you do what you do. But when you want to get into just the major pivotal moments that you've experienced, I wouldn't really go beyond 5. I think that's too many because ideally you share it in a way that they can quickly and easily understand and share with someone else so that it travels more. And when you get too many, then it becomes cumbersome. They forget, they confuse them. So I wouldn't go more than 5 of your biggest moments.
And I'm guessing that ideally one of those brand stories hopefully would be your brand origin story of how your business first came into existence, if you can tie that into a struggle or something else that will really relate to your customer avatar.
Yes. So that's, when I said start with 1, that's the one that you want to develop first is why are you even doing what you do? Why do you care so much about whatever it is you do? What's your connection to it? So not just tell me, it's never just reciting your resume. Well, I went to this place and I worked here, so now I do this. It's so what? Who cares? Why should I care about that? The story comes from why you care and what makes them care. That's the story of it.
Okay, I think that's great advice, and a great place to start. So now, once you've done that, I mean, what are there a set of questions you should ask yourself to help you kind of really develop that story?
When I work with one-on-one clients, I do a lot of these. We typically do a brand story that's related to something very specific that they're selling. And so we'll relate it to why that's so important. But we actually go back to their childhood, because what is so fascinating to me is that when we are young and when we are, all those impressions are made, the things that we really enjoyed doing or the things that we hated, the struggles that we had when we were very young are typically where we end up and why we care about what we care about when we're older. And it's like those teen and 20s years. Sometimes we try and defy that and rebel against that, and then we come back to it. So what I love to do in some of these brand stories for, a specific launch or a specific product or even just their business overall is start with childhood, and we go chronologically and we talk about what stood out to them as important or influential or their favorite things or their most difficult things, kind of in each of the major sections of their life. And, we try and do it in just a half an hour. So it's not like you need to pour over this for 8 hours. Just think about what's the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about these different types of things. Write them down, 30 minutes, and then just start saying, okay, what are the patterns? What are the themes? And always, every single client I've done this for, it is fascinating the way things that really were interesting to them or empowered them or they had the most fun with as a child is tied into very closely why they care so much about what they do now. And that in turn makes it much more interesting for their audience and draws them in. Because if it's not interesting, they'll tune out.
Yeah, I think that's true. Now I do want to ask you a quick question about, you mentioned creating a story journal, and this is something I think I struggle with. How can an entrepreneur go about figuring out what, the kinds of things happening in everyday life that they should be documenting and noticing? And I bring it up because I can always see how other people can do this. My pastor, for example, is fantastic about bringing things up about, his kids that somehow relate to the message.
Right.
But I would never have thought to even remember that event. So how do you figure that out and chronicle it so it'll be there in the future?
Practice. It's really, if you feel like if you were in school and you were given an assignment that you had to do that, you would find a way. But that does not come easily for anyone. Any writer, any pastor, any storyteller will tell you that isn't something that was instinctive from birth. That is learned. That is an amazing skill to have, but the only way you're going to do it is practice. So one exercise that I would recommend is think about what it is that you and your spouse or you and your best friends or you and your colleagues are talking about the next day. Oh my gosh, you're never going to believe what I had to deal with last night. I was trying to work on this, and my 2-year-old ended up vomiting all over, whatever it is. So it's just those little things that might seem trivial when you think about, well, that has nothing to do with my business. But just like you were mentioning about your pastor, they are these disruptions or frustrations that can trigger connections. But if you don't force yourself to start doing that, so what I recommend is if you can take even 15 minutes on a Saturday and if you can do 3 minutes at the end of the day and just write down somewhere like, what were the conversations that I had that I probably felt like had nothing to do about anything, but they were just fun or interesting, and just like 3 words that'll help you remember that. And by the end of the week, just think about a few of those. Those can be great even for email marketing. So it's that next week when you're thinking about, all right, here's my message. Now, how do I share something personal to make it a little bit lighter and have that connection be there? And you'll be surprised when you start forcing yourself to write down the things that happen. That's where those connections are, but they don't happen magically. It's only by forcing yourself to do it. Sadly, I wish I had a better answer for that.
Well, no, that's fine. I just, it's often some of these small stories that, are compelling and you just wouldn't think about it. And so I think part of it is you're right. You need to get in the practice of doing it. Like I mentioned to you before we started recording today that I had spent much of the day doing something silly, arguing with people on Facebook. I should probably make a note about that.
Yes.
It's probably something that I could use in marketing, especially because I was arguing about something related to the service I provide. So, and it's just thinking about it and being smart about doing those things, I think is important. And that's what I heard you say. Just practice doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I think that's great advice. Now, before we wrap up, the one thing I always like to ask my guests is to give a piece of advice of something that someone could do, say, in 5 minutes a day or get done by the end of the week to really build their business. And if you could pick one thing, what would it be?
Force yourself to start writing your stories. It is not something that is an easy or enjoyable practice, but just like what we were talking a minute ago about what are the tiny little things that make your life frustrating or interesting or funny, start writing those down. And even if you only start sharing them in a journal to yourself, you need to start. And then you really need to get into the practice of doing these brainstorms. So everybody has their topics for their business that they think about. So brainstorm stuff that has nothing to do with that just has to do with your life. And that could be 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the week, really. And the first few times you try it, you might feel like, I'm not coming up with anything. My brain can't even get into that space. Maybe give yourself 15 minutes. But if you keep doing that consistently, you're creating neural pathways in your brain that they're not already there. So it takes some doing. So I would say just practice. For me, it felt impossible when I started with mine. I didn't know where to start. I felt like I'd start with trying to write down one memory and end up somewhere else. And it was incredibly frustrating. But it's just like learning to do anything. It will improve, you will get better, and it will make an enormous difference to your audience and your business. They're going to start connecting with you. And even when you start feeling like this is junk, I don't even know why I'm going to include this, when you just start making any inroads in making your messaging more personalized, the tiniest things are going to stand out to your audience. And I wouldn't be surprised if you start getting responses, especially to emails and things, when you include these more personal things, even if you think it's not a full-blown story, it's really just this little snippet. Start wherever you can. It'll give you confidence. It'll help your brain start thinking that way, and it will grow, but it really just takes discipline.
I think that's a great piece of advice. And I had a feeling from your last answer, that's where you were going to go. So I'm glad you did. And Christie, I want to thank you for all of the great advice you've given. And where can my listeners get in touch with you? Because quite honestly, I think we all need to work at this. And I'm betting that working with you would be a great way for my listeners to actually do that.
Yeah, so I have a free cheat sheet that's called Become Your Audience Bestie. And if what I have said has resonated with you and you think, yeah, I need to start figuring this out, that's going to have some really specific questions for brainstorming and even kind of breaking down how much time and when do I need to do this. That's all going to be in this freebie. So I know that Bobby's going to have that in the show notes. So I would recommend starting with that. And if you decide, hey, you know what? I really need to get this figured out, then I would say learn my system, Stories That Convert. And I think he's going to have a link to that as well. You can check that out. But if you want me on social media, I'm Christie Bilbrey pretty much on every single platform.
Yeah, and we'll have links to all of that, listeners, so that you can find it. Her freebie, her course, her social media as well. So, Christie, thank you so much for coming on and for giving such great information to my listeners.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for now. Listeners, stay tuned for the quick legal lesson after the break.
And now for today's legal lesson.
Yeah! Hey there, Christie had some great advice. I loved listening to her tell stories. She is just so good at it, and it's something that we all need to be working on. I'm going to work on it this year. It's one of my goals for the year, and I hope you are too. Now, in this legal lesson, I'm going to address a couple of different issues that you need to think about as you build up your story bank. And it's a couple of legal concepts that could apply depending on your situation. And the two issues are, number one, we're going to talk about confidentiality issues. And second, we're going to talk about the right to publicity. Both of these legal concepts could apply as you're developing your story, so you need to think about them and be aware of them as you're thinking it through. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's start with confidentiality. Now, this is something we don't think about a lot. I have to think about it more than others because as a lawyer, technically anyone I've represented, anything I've done for them is automatically confidential. So I don't even have to have a confidentiality agreement. It's not just confidential, it's privileged, it's owned by them. So I have to get permission to talk about any kind of legal work I've done. But that's probably not going to apply to you in your business. But at the same time, you probably do have confidentiality restrictions in various of your agreements. And so you have to think about that when you are thinking it through. Now, I heard someone talking about this recently about trying to get case studies and testimonials for their business or for a launch. And they basically said the problem is that they have confidentiality agreements in all of their kind of contracts that they work with people that basically say you can't even disclose the fact that we've worked together. So you need to be aware of that when you're thinking through potential stories you could tell, because obviously, if you have a confidentiality agreement or requirement in a contract that says you can't tell anything about us working together or anything like that, you can't use it in your stories unless you go out and get the consent from that client, from that customer, or from someone else. And it might not just be a customer. It might be a business partner or some other commercial partner where you had some experience that's kind of relevant and you would like to include. Well, you got to look and see, did you have a confidentiality agreement in place? And if so, does it restrict what you can say? So you just need to think about that. And quite honestly, I mean, I've been in situations where I hear entrepreneurs getting so close to the line that it makes me nervous. For example, I was a guest on a podcast once, and the podcast host starts talking about how he had been in a legal dispute with a big company and that they finally resolved it. And he didn't name the company, luckily, but at the same time, like alarm bells are going off in my head because me as a lawyer, I know that just about every legal settlement has a confidentiality clause. It will just say, you're not going to talk about it. And so I get worried about things like that. Hopefully those kinds of issues don't apply to you because you haven't had those kind of legal experiences, but I use it as a teaching moment to make sure that you're thinking through, is there some reason why I'm required to keep this confidential or get permission from someone before I talk about it? So that's the first issue. When you're thinking about your stories, make sure there's no confidentiality concerns you have to address. Now, the second legal issue we're going to talk about here is the concept of the right to publicity. Now, under the right to publicity, every person has the right to control how their name, image, and likeness is used in commerce. Now, the traditional problems you're going to have with the right to publicity are endorsements, right? You can't imply an endorsement from someone without their permission. But also, you have to think through these things more broadly. So if I wanted to tell a story about how I worked with big name entrepreneur X and they did all of these things, I have to be careful that I'm not using that entrepreneur's name as a way to promote my business. I have to be careful about that. And I got to be honest with you, it's not a clear line here because the rule would generally say I can't use their name, image, or likeness for any commercial purpose without their permission. But let's be honest. I mean, I'm going to tell stories, right? I'm going to talk about how, I was at some event and I was interacting with this person and that person, and that's not going to be the problem. The problem that you have to be really careful about is implying an endorsement. So in other words, if you're going to tell a story about working with someone, about anything like that, you have to make sure that you have the release and the right to do that. And so a clear example of how to do that is in the context of testimonials or anything like that, you need to get people to sign a release that gives you the permission to use that information. Now, I do that by collecting testimonials online electronically, and it's a survey monkey survey form that I have. And up front, I talk about the right to publicity and explain what's going to happen with it. And then I go through the questions, and there's a block where I tell them a little bit more and say, hey, by clicking below, you are going to be agreeing to this. And then then they have to click the box and say yes, that they're giving me permission. Or, I mean, I guess they could submit it without it, but then I can't use the testimonial. So I'm only going to use that testimonial or a case study or a story from that person if they agree by checking that box. So that's going to be the trick as you're developing those kinds of case studies and stories from that. Make sure you get a release of their of their right to publicity so that you can use the information. Now, the trickier thing is going to be talking about things like other programs you're in, and other people and other big name entrepreneurs. Now, you can tell a story, but again, you got to be careful that you don't come close to the line of anyone thinking that you're trying to suggest some kind of endorsement or anything like that because you're talking about how you met with, talked with, etc. Personally, I just stay away from it. I'm not going to do it unless I get the permission to do it, unless someone says, yeah, sure, you can talk about it. I'm just not going to do it by talking about some big name entrepreneur that, I was having a conversation with or something like that, because I just think it's not something I want to do. And also it's a bit of a form issue as much as anything else. And by form, I mean a manners issue. If I talked with someone, worked with someone, etc., I want to ask them before I'm going to start talking about it. I just want to ask them just to, as common decency, which it's kind of funny. This is an area where the law and common decency are actually pretty similar. You ought to get permission from someone before you talk about them in your story. And that kind of applies, I think, across the board, both with the confidentiality issue, but also with the right to publicity. Now, I'm not saying you have to get permission every single time, but if you're going to mention someone by name, it's probably a good piece of advice. I mean, if it's someone that you actually have contact with, get their permission, because you wouldn't want them to hear you tell the story and then after the fact say, I don't like that you told that story. I didn't want you to talk about that. So make sure that you get that permission at the outset, and that will make sure that you're addressing both of these issues, the right to publicity, but also the confidentiality issue. So as you're developing your stories, make sure you do that and you will be in good shape. That's it for this lesson. Now, I'm right now in the middle of rolling out my new membership site. It's called the Online Genius membership site. It's where I've got loads of legal training on topics that are really specific and related to online entrepreneurship that I think are relevant to you. There's also forms as part of this initial rollout. People are getting the forms included for a price that normally would be only the online training. If you want to learn more about it, if you want to understand what this is, you can go to or just go to youronlinegenius.com/membership launch. If you go there, youronlinegenius.com/membership launch, you'll be taken to a replay of the webinar I did recently where you can find out about it. The special pricing for the launch is going to be available until the middle of May sometime. After that, the pricing will go up, but the membership will still be around. If you have any questions, reach out. But again, I think this is something you're really going to enjoy if you're enjoying these legal lessons and what I'm doing here. So go to youronlinegenius.com/membership launch and you'll get all the details. Until next week, I'm Bobby Klink, and I look forward to next week's episode where we've got some really great content about a subject that I think you're going to enjoy. So I hope you'll tune in next time. Until then, this is Bobby Klink.
Thanks for listening. And remember to visit mistakes.youronlinegenius.com to get your essential guide to the 4 legal mistakes that can doom your business and how to avoid them. Join us next week for another episode to expand your online genius and your success.